What did humans eat before they learned to control fire? It sounds like a simple question, but the real answer is far stranger than most people imagine. There were no roasted vegetables, no grilled meat, no boiling water, and no warm meals waiting at the end of the day. For millions of years, our ancestors survived on food that was completely raw. Tough meat, fibrous plants, insects, bone marrow, wild fruit, nuts, roots, and sometimes carcasses that were already beginning to decay. Eating was not a comfortable daily routine. It was a constant battle against hunger, bacteria, parasites, hard-to-chew food, seasonal shortages, and the simple challenge of extracting enough energy from ingredients that had never been softened or chemically transformed by heat. And yet our ancestors survived, not just for a few desperate years, but generation after generation, across an enormous stretch of evolutionary history. To understand how they managed it, we need to step back into a world where every meal was raw, every water source was potentially dangerous, and finding enough calories could determine whether an entire group survived. Fire feels inseparable from humanity today, but in evolutionary terms, it arrived surprisingly late. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. The genus Homo stretches back close to 3 million years. Regular, controlled fire use appears to have become widespread somewhere between roughly 400,000 and 1 million years ago, although there is evidence of earlier, more occasional use. The key word is regular. A natural wildfire could provide temporary access to flames or cooked animal remains, but that is very different from deliberately maintaining fire and using it as a dependable daily technology. For an enormous portion of hominin history, fire was not part of ordinary life. That means our ancestors spent millions of years eating an entirely raw diet, not because it was fashionable, healthy, or spiritually pure, but because there was no alternative. Let us begin with meat. Meat consumption was one of the most important dietary shifts in human evolution, and it began long before cooking. Ancient animal bones bearing cut marks from stone tools date back at least 2.5 million years, and possibly even earlier. These marks show that early hominins were using sharp stone flakes to remove flesh and process carcasses. Since controlled fire was not yet routinely available, that meat was eaten raw. For well over 1 million years, hominins consumed animal flesh without roasting, boiling, smoking, or grilling it. And raw meat was not easy food. Uncooked muscle contains tough fibers, connective tissue, cartilage, and collagen. It requires far more chewing than cooked meat. Heat softens these structures, but without heat, the jaws and teeth have to do nearly all of the work. Imagine chewing a piece of raw wild animal muscle with no knife, no tenderizing, and no cooking. Every bite would require time, strength, and patience. This helps explain why many early hominins had larger molars, heavier jaws, and more powerful chewing muscles than modern humans. Their faces were built to process foods that were mechanically demanding. Cooking would later reduce that burden. But before cooking, the mouth was part of the food processing technology. Early hominins were not necessarily swallowing huge chunks of untouched meat. Stone tools could slice flesh into smaller pieces, making it easier to chew and digest. Cutting food outside the mouth reduced the amount of work the teeth needed to perform. Even a simple sharp stone could act as a primitive external tooth, but mechanical difficulty was only one problem. Raw meat also carried bacteria, parasites, and disease. Today, food safety guidelines warn against eating raw or undercooked meat because it may contain organisms such as Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, and many different parasites. Early hominins had no refrigeration, sterilized tools, clean kitchens, or temperature-controlled cooking. They were repeatedly exposed to foodborne pathogens. So how did they survive? Part of the answer may involve their digestive physiology. Human stomach acid is highly acidic, which helps destroy many organisms before they reach the intestines. Some researchers have suggested that this strong acidity reflects a long evolutionary history of consuming food with a high pathogen load, including raw meat and scavenged carcasses. But there is another, less comforting answer. Many individuals probably did not survive. Food poisoning, parasitic infection, and intestinal disease may have been ordinary causes of illness and death. Early hominins lived in environments where mortality was already high because of predators, injuries, starvation, whether childbirth, infection, and competition. Raw food was simply one more danger in a world already filled with them. The fact that populations survived does not mean every individual handled the diet safely. It means enough individuals survived long enough to reproduce. And not all parts of an animal were equally difficult to eat. Early hominins likely valued organs such as the liver, kidneys, brain, and other soft tissues. These parts required less chewing than dense muscle and contained concentrated nutrients. Bone marrow may have been especially important. Archaeologists have discovered ancient bones with percussion marks showing that hominins deliberately smashed them open. Inside was marrow, soft, fatty, rich in calories, and easy to consume without cooking. In a world where food was unpredictable, fat was extremely valuable. A small amount of marrow could provide far more energy than a large quantity of leaves or fibrous roots. Breaking open bones also allowed hominins to access a resource that many predators could not easily reach after the flesh had already been removed. This may have given early humans an important scavenging opportunity. A large carnivore might kill an animal, eat the soft organs and major muscles, then move on. Hominins arriving later could use stone tools to remove remaining flesh and smash bones that still contained fat-rich marrow. This brings us to one of the most uncomfortable parts of the pre-fire diet. Some of the meat was probably not fresh. Early hominins may have actively hunted smaller animals, but they also scavenged carcasses killed by other predators. Depending on when they arrived, the meat could range from recently killed to significantly decomposed. Modern humans are strongly repulsed by the smell and appearance of rotten meat, partly because those signals warn us about dangerous pathogens. But scavenging animals such as hyenas and vultures regularly consume decomposing flesh. Early hominins may have occupied a middle position, not specialized carrion eaters, but opportunistic enough to accept food that modern people would reject instantly. When hunger is severe, standards change. A carcass that smelled unpleasant might still contain calories capable of keeping a group alive. However, meat was only part of the story. For many hominin populations, plant foods probably supplied most of their daily calories. The problem was that many energy-rich plants are difficult to digest when raw. Tubers, roots, and underground storage organs can contain large amounts of starch. But raw starch is locked inside structures that human digestive enzymes struggle to break apart efficiently. Cooking changes this through a process known as gelatinization. Heat and moisture cause starch granules to swell, rupture, and become more accessible to digestive enzymes. In simple terms, cooking allows the body to extract more energy while doing less digestive work. Without cooking, a meaningful portion of raw starch may pass through the digestive system without being fully absorbed. This creates an evolutionary puzzle. If roots and tubers were available, but much of their energy was difficult to access, how did pre-fire hominins obtain enough calories? The answer was probably a combination of food selection and mechanical processing. Pounding, crushing, slicing, and chewing plant material could break cellular structures and expose more surface area to digestive enzymes. These methods did not provide the same benefits as cooking, but they still improved digestibility. Fermentation may also have played a role. Fruit or plant material left in warm conditions naturally begins to ferment. Microorganisms break down parts of the food, sometimes making nutrients easier to access. This would not necessarily have been a deliberate, carefully controlled process, but hominins may have consumed naturally fermented foods when they encountered them. More importantly, early hominins probably relied heavily on foods that were already easy to digest without heat. Ripe fruit contains sugars that the body can absorb quickly. Nuts and seeds provide fat and protein. Tender leaves and young shoots are easier to process than woody or mature plant tissue. Before cooking, the most valuable plant foods may have been the ones nature had already made soft, sweet, fatty, or easily accessible. Tubers were still useful, especially when other foods were scarce, but cooking would later transform them into a much more powerful calorie source. Fire did not merely add variety to the menu. It unlocked energy that had always been present, but was difficult for the body to obtain. Then there were insects. Insects rarely receive much attention in popular stories about human evolution, but they may have been one of the most dependable foods available. Termites, ants, grubs, beetle larvae, and other small creatures can provide meaningful amounts of protein and fat. They require no cooking, are often available in large numbers, and can sometimes be collected with relatively little energy. Our closest living relatives offer an important clue. Chimpanzees use sticks and plant stems to extract termites and ants from nests. This behavior requires tool selection, technique, patience, and knowledge of where colonies are located. Early hominins were at least capable of similar behavior and probably used simple tools to obtain insects long before the appearance of controlled fire. A termite mound may not look like a feast to us, but in a difficult season, it could function like a reliable protein source. Insects were small, but they were predictable, and predictability matters when every other food source depends on weather, migration, competition, or luck. Honey was another extraordinary prize. Unlike raw starch, honey requires almost no digestion before its sugars can be absorbed. It is calorie-dense, portable, and immediately useful to the body. The problem was getting it. Wild bee colonies defend their nests aggressively. Without smoke from fire to calm the bees, collecting honey would have been painful and dangerous. But the reward was enormous. A successful raid on a hive could provide a sudden concentration of calories rarely found elsewhere in nature. The pre-fire menu was therefore much broader than raw steak and wild fruit. It included meat, organs, marrow, insects, honey, leaves, seeds, nuts, roots, tubers, and probably many foods that modern people would not even recognize as edible. The digestive system itself preserves clues about this transition. Compared with other great apes, humans have a relatively small gastrointestinal tract, particularly a smaller colon. A large gut is metabolically expensive. It requires energy to grow, maintain, and operate. This is important because the brain is also extremely expensive tissue. Although the brain represents only a small percentage of body mass, it consumes a disproportionately large share of the body's energy. Researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed what became known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. The basic idea is that the expansion of the human brain may have been made possible partly because another energetically expensive organ system, the gut, became smaller. A higher quality diet, including more meat and eventually cooked food, could provide more usable energy while requiring less digestive tissue. Cooking effectively moves part of digestion outside the body. Instead of the gut doing all the work, heat begins breaking down food before it is eaten. If this argument is correct, cooking did not simply make meals more enjoyable. It helped reshape the human body and may have contributed to the energetic conditions that allowed larger brains to evolve. But this change did not happen all at once. Before routine fire use, early hominins probably retained larger and more powerful digestive systems better suited to raw food. They also had teeth and jaws capable of handling more mechanical stress. Fossil teeth provide another record of what they ate. Microwear analysis examines tiny scratches and pits on tooth enamel. Different foods leave different microscopic patterns. Many early hominin teeth show wear consistent with hard, tough, or fibrous food. But not every species followed the same strategy. Members of the genus Paranthropus had enormous chewing muscles, broad faces, and massive molars. Their anatomy suggests they were capable of processing extremely resistant plant material. Early members of Homo followed a different path. Their teeth and jaws were generally less specialized, suggesting a more flexible diet supported by tool use and adaptable behavior. This difference matters. There was never one universal pre-fire diet. A hominin living in a forest did not eat exactly what another hominin ate on an open savanna. A population near a lake had different opportunities from one living in a dry interior region. Some groups may have depended heavily on fruit and insects. Others relied more on seeds, underground plants, scavenged meat, shellfish, or small animals. Diet changed with geography, season, climate, and species. In tropical forests, fruit and insects might be available through much of the year, although individual species still followed seasonal cycles. On the savanna, conditions could change dramatically between wet and dry seasons. During periods of abundance, hominins might have access to fruit, fresh leaves, eggs, insects, and young animals. During the dry season, those foods could disappear. Underground storage organs then became valuable because they remained protected beneath the soil. Nuts and seeds could last longer than fruit. Meat and marrow could become increasingly important when easier plant foods were scarce. Survival required more than strong jaws. It required memory, which plants were edible, which roots contained water. Where did animals gather during the dry season? Which insects emerged after rain? Which trees produced fruit at a particular time of year? Which water sources were safe, and which often caused illness? This environmental knowledge had to be learned, remembered, and probably shared socially. A mistake could be fatal. Eating the wrong plant could cause poisoning. Digging in the wrong location wasted valuable energy. Drinking from a contaminated pool could weaken an entire group. The pre-fire diet therefore placed constant pressure on cognition and behavior. Finding food was not simply a matter of wandering until something edible appeared. It required planning, observation, experimentation, tool use, and accumulated knowledge. Water created an equally serious challenge. Once humans gained fire, they could eventually use heat to make water safer. Boiling destroys many bacteria, parasites, and protozoa. Before fire, that option did not exist. Rivers, ponds, streams, and temporary pools could all contain pathogens. Animals might drink, defecate, or die near the same water source. Early hominins had to drink anyway. They may have reduced risk by preferring flowing water, collecting rainwater, choosing certain springs, or relying partly on moisture from fruit and plant material. But there was no guaranteed method of sterilization. Waterborne illness must have been a persistent background threat, just like foodborne disease. This means the burden of raw living extended beyond the menu. Everything entering the body carried risk. Food storage was another major limitation. Today, surplus food can be refrigerated, frozen, dried, canned, smoked, or sealed. Before fire, most of those options were impossible. A large carcass provided a temporary feast, but meat spoiled quickly, especially in warm climates. Without cooking or smoking, hominins faced pressure to consume it before bacteria, insects, and competing scavengers destroyed the resource. This may have encouraged rapid sharing. If one individual or small group controlled more meat than they could eat, keeping it offered limited benefit. Sharing it with others prevented waste and could create social obligations. Someone who received meat today might return the favor after a successful hunt tomorrow. Reciprocal sharing would have helped smooth out the unpredictability of food acquisition. One day, a group might find nothing. The next day, someone might locate a carcass or help capture an animal too large for one individual to consume. When food cannot be stored, social relationships become a kind of storage system. You cannot preserve the meat, but you can preserve goodwill. Nuts and seeds offered a different advantage. Because they contain relatively little moisture and often have protective shells, they can remain edible longer than fresh meat or fruit. They were not only nutritious, they were strategically valuable. A group could collect them during abundance and consume them gradually. Tubers and roots also had a natural storage advantage. Many plants keep energy underground precisely so they can survive difficult seasons. Instead of harvesting every tuber at once, hominins could leave them in the ground until needed. The landscape itself became a food store. To modern eyes, this may look like simple gathering. In reality, it required detailed knowledge of plant life cycles, locations, soil conditions, and seasons. Living chimpanzees offer a useful comparison. Wild chimpanzee communities consume an extraordinary variety of foods. At some research sites, their diets include more than 100 plant species, along with insects, eggs, honey, and meat. They track seasonal changes and travel to specific areas when particular fruits become available. They use tools to extract insects and access difficult resources. They also hunt. Chimpanzees have been observed coordinating attacks on smaller primates such as colobus monkeys. Different individuals may take different positions during a hunt, and meat is often distributed among group members afterward. Chimpanzees are not perfect models for early humans. Both lineages have evolved independently for millions of years. Still, their behavior proves something important. A primate without cooking can maintain a complex raw diet involving tool use, hunting, food sharing, seasonal knowledge, and strategic decision-making. Early hominins, with increasingly sophisticated stone tools and expanding cognitive abilities, were likely capable of at least comparable flexibility. This also suggests that the old debate between hunting and scavenging may be too simple. Early hominins probably did both. They could scavenge large carcasses left by powerful predators while also hunting smaller, more manageable animals when the opportunity appeared. The balance likely changed across species, environments, and time periods. There was no single strategy. That adaptability may have been their greatest advantage. Early hominins were not the fastest animals on the landscape. They were not the strongest. They had no claws, armor, venom, or enormous teeth. What they had was flexibility. They could use stones to cut flesh, smash bones, crack nuts, and process plants. They could move between forest and grassland. They could exploit food left behind by predators. They could eat insects when meat was unavailable and roots when fruit disappeared. They could learn from failure and possibly pass useful knowledge to others. In a raw food world, survival belonged not necessarily to the strongest individual, but to the group that could solve the widest range of problems. Modern raw food diets also offer a limited but revealing comparison. Studies of people consuming strict raw diets have often found lower body weight and difficulty obtaining sufficient calories. In some women, extremely low energy intake has been associated with menstrual disruption. Modern participants still have access to cultivated produce, clean water, medical care, refrigeration, blenders, knives, and year-round food distribution. Early hominins had none of those advantages. Their raw diet was not a hidden nutritional ideal that modern civilization destroyed. It was difficult, inefficient, and dangerous. They survived it because their bodies, behaviors, and environments were different, and because they had no other choice. Then fire changed everything. Heat softened meat and connective tissue, making chewing easier. It gelatinized starch, allowing the body to extract more calories from roots and tubers. It destroyed many parasites and bacteria. It made some toxic plants safer. It created opportunities to preserve food through drying and smoking. It provided warmth and protection, allowing hominins to occupy colder environments and remain active after sunset. Eventually, it made water safer as well. Cooking did not merely add another food processing technique. It transformed the economics of survival. The same amount of food could provide more usable energy. The body spent less effort chewing and digesting. Foods that had once been marginal became dependable staples. This may have supported smaller teeth, smaller jaws, a reduced gut, larger brains, and increasingly complex social behavior. But the story before fire deserves just as much attention as the story after it. For millions of years, our ancestors lived in a world where every meal demanded physical effort, environmental knowledge, and tolerance for risk. They ate raw meat from hunted animals and scavenged carcasses. They cracked bones for marrow. They consumed organs before they spoiled. They gathered fruit, nuts, seeds, leaves, and underground plants. They dug, pounded, sliced, mashed, chewed, and fermented what they could. They collected insects and risked bee stings for honey. They drank from natural water sources without knowing which invisible organisms might be waiting inside. They shared food because it could not be preserved. They remembered where resources appeared and when they disappeared. Their diet was not primitive in the sense of being simple. It was extraordinarily complex because nothing had been made easy yet. Every calorie came with a problem attached. Meat had to be cut and chewed. Bones had to be broken. Roots had to be found and dug up. Insects had to be extracted. Honey had to be defended against bees. Water had to be chosen carefully. Food had to be eaten before it rotted or stolen by another animal. And the individuals who became best at solving these problems were more likely to survive. That is the deeper meaning of the pre-fire diet. It was not simply an uncomfortable phase before humanity discovered cooking. It was a multi-million-year test of adaptability. Long before cities, agriculture, language as we know it, or advanced technology, our ancestors were already using knowledge, cooperation,